Hello, my name is Kassara and I have been teaching English for the last 45 years to students of all ages, from young ones to university students. I am very happy to be addressing Russian teachers of English, and I hope that by the end of this seminar and webinar basically, you will be able to have a clearer picture about the verb and tense system of English, which I reckon are the backbone of the English language. In this webinar, we shall be looking closely at the verb and tense system of English, and I hope that you will find it much easier in your work to teach it to your students. Today's webinar is called A Simple Way to Teach and Understand Verbs and Tenses in English. The whole presentation revolves around what we call the basic language functions. They are the 6 universal language functions that are found in every language. Let's start and have a look at this program. So, today we shall be talking, first of all, about teachers. Then, what we call the spiral syllabus. After that, we shall be talking about the nucleus. The nucleus is the essential part of the language from which forms the starting point of every teacher's program. Then we will look at the 6 universal language functions, after which we will look at the English verb system and finally at the English tense system. So let's have some fun with English. Our objectives. The objectives of this webinar are to share a teaching philosophy. What do I mean by a teaching philosophy? I have been teaching for 45 years, and over the years I have developed my own methodology, my own idea of how English should be taught. This is what I mean by a teaching philosophy, and I want to share my experience with you. Secondly, I want to share a mental syllabus. What do I mean? You don't need, once you have had a look at this webinar and at some of the patterns and models that I will show you, you will have a very simple program in your head that you can rely on anytime you want to design new material or you want to design new teaching programs. Then I want to have a look at the practical aspects of English grammar. We are not going to go deeply into English grammar, but we will look at how to make something that looks very complex and very complicated, and we'll try to make it look simple. Simple for us and simple for our students. Now we come to the non-objectives of this webinar. First of all, I'm not trying to teach teachers how to do their job. I'm sure you are all very experienced and highly qualified and are satisfied with the way you are teaching. Secondly, I am not trying to provide a detailed analysis of English grammar. As I said, I'm trying to present a model which will make certain aspects of grammar, which I think are fundamental, look more simple, both for you and for your students. Thirdly, I'm not trying to prescribe any methodology. I will not dictate to you how you should approach your teaching systems. I will simply share my experiences with you. First of all, people often ask, and I have often been asked, what is the best method? What is the best method to teach a language? As you know, thousands and thousands of books have been written on how to teach, and very often people wonder, but is there a method? Is there a best method? The answer to this is very simple. The best method is the one that works. In other words, if you have been teaching your students successfully and you see they are learning, then that method is the best for you. The best method is the one that works, the one that gives results. Teachers. I have often quoted when giving seminars and teaching programs, I have often used this quote from William Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. This can be said for any professional, but it can also be said for teachers. Some teachers are natural teachers. They are born teachers. They can teach without anybody having taught them or trained them how to teach. Those are born great. Some achieve greatness. Some train to become teachers and become very successful teachers. Others have greatness thrust upon them. We have all had teachers and professors who, although pretended to be teachers, were not so terribly good. So it's just a question. If you're not a born teacher, then you must train to become a good teacher. But with experience and with passion, we can all become good teachers. What is the teacher's quest? Here you have a picture of Sir Galahad, a knight from King Arthur's court, who is on a quest to find the Holy Grail. Now, as you know, the Holy Grail was this chalice supposedly used by Christ at the Last Supper, but it was also a magical cup that could bring peace, prosperity, and wealth to the country if found. So the knights in King Arthur's court went out to look for it, and they had to face many dangers. What is the teacher's quest? The teacher's quest is to find an exceptionally good method, an easier method, by which his or her students can learn faster and better. This is something that we all look for. We're always looking for better ways to make our teaching more effective. So, what do teachers do to make their teaching more effective? First of all, they pick and choose. What do I mean? Experienced teachers and good teachers are flexible and eclectic. What do I mean by eclectic? By eclectic, I mean that teachers can pick and choose those methodologies, those theories that best suit their teaching situation. People who are rigid and stick to one system just because they have always done it this way are not terribly flexible and therefore risk not being terribly successful either. Teachers try to find those systems that best suit their requirements. They have to understand that no two teaching situations are alike. So they cannot use the same book, the same method, the same approach, the same lesson in different situations. They have to adapt and adjust. No two learners learn in the same manner. I'm sure that you, as experienced teachers, realize that your learners have different learning strategies. They learn differently. They learn with different speeds. And they study in a different way. So, what is the challenge? The challenge is to make your teaching learner-oriented, not teacher-oriented. The old-fashioned idea of the teacher being the font of all knowledge, the teacher that knows everything, and just pours his knowledge onto the students, hoping that some of it will stick, is old-fashioned and passé. Today, teaching is learner-oriented. We try to understand how our students learn. We try to understand their different strategies for learning. So, what is the teacher's challenge? The teacher's challenge is to create the conditions under which a language or any other academic subject for that matter can be learned. So, what are these conditions that we need to create so that our learners can learn better? These are quite simple to follow. First of all, we have to be clear. Our message to our students has to be clear and simple. It has to be understood by our students, and we need to ensure that it has been understood. We cannot assume anything. We have to check and test that it has been understood. It has to be simple. Teachers who want to show off by making things look complicated in order to impress their students are not terribly good teachers. Teachers need to make something complex, something simple, something difficult look simple. Finally, our teaching needs to be focused. It's useless to try and give our students too much information which they cannot handle and which is sometimes irrelevant. Our teaching has to be focused. We need to have small targets, what I call small achievable objectives, so that as each objective is understood by the students, as each objective is learned by the students, then they feel successful. And success will bring success, and the students can move forward. Now, let's talk about teaching programs and methodologies. We've all been to school, we've all been to the traditional grammatical method, where we had Unit 1 in our book, and then we proceeded to Unit 2, and then we proceeded to Unit 3. And this was called the linear method. The problem with this method, of course, was that once Unit 1 was covered, it was forgotten. There was very little revision. It was assumed that it had been learnt. The same can be said for Unit 2, and so on, which means that the students were simply tested on those units and forgotten. The fact is that with time, students would have forgotten what had been covered earlier, and they would simply be moving forward, but learning less and less. There is an alternative to this, what I call the spiral method. I'm sure you all know what a spiral is. It is something which starts from the center and it starts opening in concentric circles. This is the spiral. So what does the spiral method teaches us? The spiral has a center, what I call the nucleus. And a good teacher will have a sum of material, an element of importance, which he calls the nucleus, which is an essential part of his teaching program. This nucleus is used time and time again. Every new lesson starts from the nucleus and then expands in an ever-increasing system of circles. Let's have a look at the nucleus that I am proposing for the teaching of tenses and verbs systems in English. Our nucleus has three parts: the English verb system, the language functions, the universal language functions, and the English tense system. Let's have a look now at the universal language functions. These are 6. Why do we call them universal? They are called universal because they exist in every language. In other words, if you want to learn Chinese, you need to ask and answer questions. You need to give commands and instructions. The same goes for Russian, the same goes for Japanese, the same goes for English, the same goes for any language. There are certain operations which need to be carried out irrespective of which language you are using. Now, let's have a look at these 6 universal language functions. And we will also use, for ease of reference, their grammatical title. First of all, we have the ability to give commands and instructions. This we call the imperative. We need to be able not only to give commands and instructions, but also to understand commands and instructions. Then there is the ability to ask and answer questions. This we call the interrogative function. Then there is a very important task, a very important function, which is the ability to say no. And this is called the negative function. As you know, in language, there are many, many ways to say no, and we have to learn how to use this function very effectively. Then there is the ability to describe things. This is called the descriptive function, and this brings into play the present tenses of English. Then there is the ability to tell stories, to narrate reports, and this is called the narrative function, which brings into play the past tenses of English. Finally, we need to talk about tomorrow, about the future, and this brings in the future function, okay? Now we come to the English verb system. Let's have a look at how this is organized. English verbs are divided into 2 main sections. On the left-hand side, we have the dictionary verbs, and on the right-hand side, we have the auxiliaries. What do we mean by dictionary verbs? Dictionary verbs are those verbs which are found in the dictionary, hundreds and hundreds of them. They carry meaning, but their frequency of occurrence is very low. In the sense, we only use them when we need them. For example, how many times a day do you use the word to fish, or to sew, or to cook? Not many times, but some people who are in the fishing business or in the sewing business will use them a lot. On the right-hand side, we have the auxiliaries. These do not carry meaning, but carry structure. They are very few in number, but they do a lot of work. They are the skeleton of the language. They are very hardworking and very important, and we need to understand what they do and how they do it. First of all, let's look at the dictionary verbs. These are, as I said, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, and they are things like eat, drink, sleep, drive, swim, etc. They also have different forms. For example, let's take the verb to swim. The infinitive to swim, then we have the third person singular swims, then we have the present participle swimming, then the past tense swam, and finally the past participle swam. Don't get confused at this stage. These shapes, I remember in the past when I was a little boy, we used to learn them in lists and lists and lists without having any relevance to any context. As you will see, once we put them in the context of our model, they will be much simpler to look at and much simpler to understand. Let's continue a little bit. We see the present participle swimming is used a lot in the continuous tenses. The present continuous and the past continuous. It combines with the auxiliary to be so that it can create a continuous tense. For example, I am teaching now in the present continuous, or I was teaching in the past continuous. So we will immediately notice that the present participle ing verbs ending in ing, has a very important role in giving us the idea of continuity in English. The same for the past participle. The past participle, which in the main ends in en or ed, is used to create the perfect tenses in English, the present perfect and the past perfect, giving us sentences like I have thought or I had taught. Now, let's look at the auxiliary verbs. As I told you, these do a lot of useful work in the language. They are very easy to remember because they are very few in number and very easy to understand. On the left-hand side, we have the main auxiliaries. First of all, auxiliaries are divided into two main sections, what we call the main auxiliaries and the modal auxiliaries. The main auxiliaries are only 3 in number, and they are very, very important and powerful auxiliaries. They are the verb to be, the verb to have, and the verb to do. The verb to do we will look at in a minute separately from the other two, because it often creates problems for teachers. But once I explain how it is used, it will become very, very simple, both to understand and to teach to your students. On the right-hand side, we have the modals. These are will, can, may, shall, and must. There are a couple more, but for simplicity's sake, we will stop there. Will becomes would, because it has a past and a conditional function. Can becomes could, may becomes might, shall becomes should, and must becomes had to. Let's look at the main characteristics of auxiliary verbs. They have 3 main characteristics, which are very important to remember, and once remembered, are very easy to understand. Number 1, every question in English, this is a rule, must have an auxiliary verb. This is a general rule in English, and there are no exceptions to it. Every question in English must have an auxiliary verb. The auxiliary verb always precedes the subject in a question. So when we make questions, the auxiliary verb always occupies the position in front of the subject. Finally, the negative not always follows an auxiliary in negative sentences in English. These 3 rules are the golden rules of auxiliaries and auxiliary use in English. Now, let's have a look at some examples. First of all, let's have a look at yes-no questions with auxiliary verbs. For example, we have the sentence, he is rich. We take the auxiliary is, we move it in front of the subject he, and it gives us is he rich? Very simple. And that is called a yes-no question because the answer can only be yes or no. We can also have another sentence with a modal auxiliary, which operates in the same way as the main auxiliaries. She can swim. We take can, the auxiliary can, move it to the front, in front of she, and it gives us can she swim? Another yes-no question, because the answer can only be yes or no. Let's have a look at WH questions. What do we mean by WH questions? WH questions are those questions which normally start with a WH word, like where, what, which, who. How is an exception, but it belongs to the same family. These questions are open-ended questions. They are questions looking for information. So they are not like the yes-no questions where the answer is yes or no, but they are open questions where the answer is full of information, which gives us in some form of information. So let's have a look. Let's have a look at the sentence with must. What must he do? If you notice, must comes before the subject and follows the WH word. So the order is first the WH word, then the auxiliary, then the subject, and then the verb. The answer, he must stop smoking. Secondly, where is the dog? Similarly, with the verb to be follows the WH word, precedes the subject, and then is followed by the object. The dog is in the garden. Where is the dog? The dog is in the garden. Another sentence with when. When can she come? She can come tomorrow. If you notice, they all follow the same order, the same structure, because they obey the 3 golden rules of auxiliaries. Now, let's have a look at some negatives with auxiliary verbs. For example, we have the sentence, he can swim. To change it into a negative sentence, we say, he cannot swim. Not follows the rule that we used before for auxiliaries. It follows the auxiliary can, and obviously the short form, as we all know, becomes cannot. But for illustration's sake, I have put not in bold after the word can, after the auxiliary can. So, he can swim, or can he swim? He cannot swim. She is rich. She is not rich, or she isn't rich. The not again follows the auxiliary to be. Now we come to our big friend, the auxiliary do. Many teachers and students find the use of the do a bit complicated and confusing. As you will see from this model, the do is a very friendly auxiliary. It is very easy to understand how it is used. It follows the same rules as for the other auxiliaries, but it is used with the dictionary verbs. In fact, the do exists in English, as we will see, to operate exclusively with the dictionary verbs. Dictionary verbs by themselves cannot form questions, cannot form negatives. They need the help of an auxiliary. And this is where the auxiliary do comes into play. So, the do helps us to make questions and negatives where there are no other auxiliaries present. For example, the auxiliary do is used only with the simple present and the simple past, because in the other tenses, like the present progressive, the present continuous, I am teaching, there is the auxiliary am. So I can make questions, am I teaching? Or I am not teaching. So I don't need to use the do. But in the sentence I teach or she teaches, we need to use the do. And our sentence becomes, does she teach? Does he teach? And she doesn't teach or he doesn't teach. Let's have a look at some examples of questions and negatives using dictionary verbs. Let's take the first one, for example. He likes coffee. We cannot say, likes he coffee? We have to say, does he like coffee? Why can't we say, likes he coffee? Because the rule says that every question in English must have an auxiliary. The same can be said for an example with a WH word. For example, he likes coffee. We cannot say, what likes he? But we have to say, what does he like? The same can be said for the negatives. We cannot say he likes not coffee. We have to say he does not like coffee or he doesn't like coffee. Now, let's talk about two other important auxiliaries, the verb to be and the verb to have. They are the two other main auxiliary verbs which are very important in the language, which play a very, very important part and which help us to create the tenses of English. First of all, they are fundamental. If we understand how they work, they can help us very easily to create these tenses. They help us to create the present continuous, the past continuous, the present perfect, and the past perfect. For example, the main auxiliary be, the verb to be, combines with the present participle ing of the verb and gives us the continuous tenses. The main auxiliary have combines with the past participle of the verb to give us the perfect tenses. So that way, with two auxiliaries, we have four other tenses. Okay? Very soon, we will look at a model, a complete model of all the tenses of English, all the 6 basic tenses of English. And you will soon see how it all fits in. Of course, it all fits in as well with our language functions, with our universal language functions, especially the functions of descriptive and narrative. The function of description, which is the present tense, where we use all present tenses to describe things, and the function of narrative, the narrative function, where we use all the past tenses to tell stories and write reports. Now, let's look at some examples with the verb to be and the continuous tenses. I am teaching English at the moment. This is the present continuous tense. I am teaching English at the moment. This is a tense which is used to describe actions which are happening now or at this moment. Similarly, we can have the same model for the past. I was teaching English last year. So last year, between January and February, for example, I was teaching English in London. Okay? This describes an action that was going on in the past. Now, let's have a look at examples with the auxiliary have and the past perfect and the perfect tenses. First of all, the present perfect. This is a tense which, again, teachers often find difficult to teach and students difficult to understand, because it is a bridge between the past and the present. In fact, it is an action which started in the past and has its effects coming into the present. So, for example, we can say, I have already drunk 2 coffees this morning. As I said, this is a tense that teachers and students often find a bit difficult to understand, simply because it is a bridge between the past and the present. It points to an action which started in the past, but its effects are still being felt in the present. And in fact, there are a number of adverbs like already, since, for, yet, never, never, which help us to identify when to use this tense. For example, let's have another example. I have visited many countries up to now. This idea of what happened in the past, but coming up to the present. The idea of up to now. It means that I am still in the present, I still have the chance to visit many other countries, but up to now, from the past up to now, I have visited many countries. The past perfect is used a lot less in English, and it describes, in a sense, a past before the past. So it's a bridge between a past which is far away and the simple past. For example, before he went to Australia, John had lived in England for 10 years. So first he lived in England, then he went to Australia. Both are past actions, but one happened before the other. As I said, the past perfect is used very little. We find it sometimes in stories and very rarely in reports. On the other hand, the present perfect is a very, very important tense. It has a very high frequency of occurrence, and it is important that we understand how it is used. Now, let's look at the main chart, if we like, the main model of the tenses of English. Let's look at the present. The present is divided very neatly into three basic tenses: the present continuous, the present simple, and the present perfect. The past, fortunately for us, and fortunately for our students, is also designed in the same manner. We have the past continuous, the past simple, and the past perfect. So as you can see, with one model, we have covered basically all the important tenses of English. Of these, the three present tenses occur very, very frequently together with the simple past. Those four tenses are extremely important in English. The other two, the past perfect and the past continuous, are also important, but they have a lesser frequency of occurrence. Now, let's look at the present tense. When to use these tenses? The present continuous describes what is happening now or at this moment. The present simple is used to describe fact and routine. For example, America is a big country. That's a fact. Russia is a very big country. It's a fact. Routine. Every day I go to the office by car. Every day I have dinner with my family at 8 o'clock. That is routine. So the simple present is used to describe facts and routine. Another fact: the sun rises in the east, the sun sets in the west. The present perfect, as we have already discussed, describes actions that have happened up to now, started in the past and building a bridge with the present and possibly going on into the future. Let's look at some examples. I am teaching English at the moment. Present continuous tense. I teach English at university. It's a fact. Simple present. I have taught English for many years. Present perfect. I started teaching English 45 years ago, and therefore I am still alive, I'm still here, and I'm still teaching English every now and then. So I have taught English from the past up to the present, and there is a possibility that I can keep on teaching English for a few more years to come. Let's look at the past tense now, the past tense model. It follows more or less the same pattern as the present tense, which makes it very convenient for us as teachers of English. So we have the past continuous at that time. What was happening at that time? For example, yesterday I was watching television with my family when the doorbell rang. Usually this tense is used to describe an action that was going on that was then interrupted by another action. So, for example, I was driving along the main road when the accident happened. Then we have fact and routine also in the past. Fact. John went to Moscow. It's a fact. He took the plane and he went to Moscow yesterday. Routine. When I was a little boy, I used to go fishing with my father. Used to. This verb is very, very special in English because it is used to describe routine in the past. Used to. When we were children, we used to play in the street. Then we have the past before the past. For example, before he married Jane, John had already been married twice. So, first he married Jane in 1994, for example, but he had been married in 1990 and in 1987. All right? So, a past before the past. Before he became a doctor, John had been working as a nurse in the general hospital. So, before he became a doctor, he had done another job. So, let's have some more examples. I was teaching English last year. So, there was a continuous action which was going on last year. I taught English in Russia in 2001. Simple past, a simple fact. Before I went to Japan to teach English, I had taught for many years in England. Past perfect. So here we can put together all that we have been saying about the tenses of English and the auxiliaries. As we see, we have now one complete model. On the left-hand side, we have the present tenses, the continuous, the simple, and the perfect. And on the right-hand side, we have the past tenses, the continuous, the simple, and the perfect. If you notice, under the simple, I have put the auxiliary do, and under the simple past, I have put the auxiliary did. This is to indicate that while the other tenses can form questions and negatives because they already have an auxiliary, the verb to be in the continuous tenses and the verb to have in the perfect tenses, the simple tenses, simple present and simple past, need the auxiliary do to form questions and negatives. With this one picture, one mental picture, which you can teach your students to draw by heart from memory, they will have a very clear bird's eye view of what English is all about. Now, there is one other model that we can have a look at, because there are two extra tenses that I have not mentioned, but which we can now look at and understand more easily. These are the present perfect continuous and the past perfect continuous. What are they? They are the combination of two concepts, the concept of continuity and the concept of perfection, in the sense of completion, the perfect tense. So, the concept of continuity can combine with the concept of completion to give us a present perfect tense and a past perfect tense. Why do we use them? We normally use them only for emphasis. For example, John is waiting for his wife, Anne. She has been taking too long shopping, and he is tired and angry. When she comes out of the shop, he tells her, I have been waiting for 2 hours. So instead of telling her, I have waited for 2 hours, he emphasizes by giving an idea of how long, minute after minute, hour after hour, he has been waiting. Similarly, in the past, for example, my father had been working for the same company all his life. To give an idea of the fact that my father used to go to work day after day, year after year, always with the same job, always in the same company, we can use the past perfect continuous to illustrate this. Now, there is one other area that we mentioned when we spoke about the 6 universal language functions, and that is the ability to speak about tomorrow. Now, many teachers, in fact, traditionally, when we were at school, we used to say that the future in English, the future tense in English is will or shall. This, in fact, is not technically correct. The future in English is not technically a tense like the other tenses we have been considering. It is a time. We can all express the future. Every language, in some languages, the future is a tense. But in English, we find that there are different ways of constructing the future. And here I'm going to give you the 3 most common and simplest ways to speak about the future. For your students, especially if they're young, or especially if they're in the early stages of English language learning, this should be more than enough. First of all, we have the future of plan. The future of plan. What is the future of plan? It is simply using the present continuous and adding an adverb of time. For example, if I say, I am playing tennis and stop there, it can mean that I am playing tennis now. But if I say, I am playing tennis tomorrow, it means I have a plan. Everything is organized, everything is arranged, and tomorrow I am playing tennis. So it becomes a future. So the present continuous, which is a tense, can easily be used to describe a future action. So I am playing tennis tomorrow. I am playing tennis this afternoon. Another way to construct the future, using going to. And this we call the future of intention. What we intend to do. I'm going to take the children to the cinema. In other words, I have the intention, not necessarily the plan, I haven't yet bought the tickets, of taking the children to the cinema. I am going to take the children to the cinema. And then we have the use of will. The will gives us a sense of decision, the future of decision. I will take the children to the cinema. I will play tennis tomorrow. The use of will here gives us a sense of decision. With these 3 models, we can use the future confidently and comfortably without being afraid of making mistakes all our lives. And your students should find it very easy to do so. Now, we have come to the conclusion of this webinar, which I hope you have found very useful and easy to understand. Let us look at what we have talked about. First of all, the spiral approach. I said that the teacher has to use a nucleus of information. This nucleus of information, as far as I'm concerned, are the 6 universal language functions. These language functions have to be taught from the very early stages right up to university, making the work more sophisticated as the students become more proficient in language. In other words, You can teach young students to make simple descriptions, but you can teach very advanced students to write very complex descriptions. You can teach young students to use very simple commands, but you can teach adult students or more advanced students to make very complex commands and instructions, as happens, for example, in many scientific books. The same goes for the narrative function. We can use the narrative function to write simple stories or to write whole novels. That is the spiral approach. Use the nucleus and always enlarge your circle, adding more vocabulary, more idiomatic expressions, more sophisticated uses of the language. The 6 language functions, the 6 universal language functions, are fundamental. They, together with the verb and tense system of English, form the core of any teaching program. I say form, I should say should form the core of any teaching program. If you adopt these 6 universal language functions and the model of the tenses of English, then together they should give you a program for life, what we call the life syllabus. The word syllabus means a teaching program. We also said that all questions and negatives are very easy to use in English because they need auxiliaries. And auxiliaries are very few in number, they're easy to remember, and they obey 3 basic rules: that all questions in English need an auxiliary, that the auxiliary always precedes the subject, and that the word not always follows an auxiliary to create negatives. Finally, the use of the auxiliary do. The auxiliary do combines or helps sentences with dictionary verbs in the simple present and simple past to create questions and negatives. With that, I conclude my webinar. I thank you for listening to my presentation. It was a great pleasure and a privilege to talk to you, and I hope there will be other occasions in the future to do so. Thank you very much.